So just to let everyone know, my name is Nadia. Thank you for attending tonight's Meet the Author event. Again, my name is Nadia. I'm with the programming department at the Woodbridge Public Library. If you have any questions or concerns throughout the presentation, you can direct them to me in the chat. I'm listed as WPL librarian. Before we begin, like I said before, your cameras are going to be turned off and so are your mics to keep us all focused on the presentation. Just to give you some more information, if you ever want to see any of our other events or different presentation that we're offering, you can check our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or our website, woodbridgelibrary.org. And now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming author Afia Atakora.
Yay! Applause, applause.
Applause.
Hello, everybody. So yes, thank you, Nujia. Thank you for having me at the Woodbridge Public Library. It looks like I can see some people in the chat that we have some local people. We have some people from away. So thank you all for being here. I'm Afia Atakora. I'm here to talk about my debut novel, which is Conjure Women. Right here. It came out in April, pretty much at the height of the lockdown. So a lot of my events have been virtual, have been online like this. But it's working out. It gives me the opportunity to meet a lot of people from a lot of different places and reach people that I wouldn't otherwise get to talk to, which is exciting. But this is my first event locally. I was born in England, but I grew up mostly in Avenel. Went to Colonia High School, shout out. And I worked at the library, worked at the Woodbridge Public Library and the Island Library. So this is my kind of first local event. So it's really exciting to be home. Yeah, I want to give you guys a little reading. If we were in person, I usually like to start with a reading. So I'll try to keep it short since it's a little different on Zoom.
Why is she just a little picture? Why isn't she the whole screen? Why isn't she?
I don't know.
I'm not sure. So we're gonna, just a reminder, we're gonna be on mute to focus on the program. Okay.
Hi.
Take it away, Afia.
All right. So I'm going to start with a reading. I'm a little picture for me too, by the way. So I think there's some buttons that might be able to put me into focus when I'm talking at least. But yeah, I'm going to begin with a reading. For those of you who don't know Conjure Women, who don't know what it's about yet, I say yet because hopefully I can convince you to read it by the end of this. Conjure Women is told in a tight narrative braid of the years just before and just after the Civil War in the US. And in it we meet Rue, who is a young midwife and healer on an isolated former plantation where she sort of ministers to the people in her town. She also comes from a sort of long line of other midwives. Her mother, who also figures into the story, is Miss Maybelle. And in the past sections, which are labeled slavery time, we meet Miss Maybelle and see some of Rue's childhood, as well as her childhood friend, Verena, who's the daughter of the plantation master. So we sort of weave back and forth through the past. And in the present, Rue is dealing with three sort of mysterious events. So there's the arrival of a charismatic preacher. There is the birth of a strange child with black eyes. And there is a sudden sickness that is sweeping through the town and creating suspicion against Rue and her abilities. So there's a lot going on. I'm going to give you a little preview. It's from the end of the book. If anyone wants to sort of read along, it's on page 376. But I promise there aren't any spoilers. This is sort of a different section from a different perspective. As I said, the story sort of weaves through time. And so this is as far back as the story goes. It's labeled in the beginning. And I will take it away. In the beginning, there was the ship hold. The early swirling motion of the sea, sickening. The heat of fever, the heat of fear, the only thing cold, the new chains, and even those warmed quick and rusted over with rubbing, with sores, with blood, with futile struggle. The darkness, the void of the black ship bottom, the darkness on the face of the deep. And then someone said unto them, let there be light, piercing light. Did you know light could hurt so bad? On the deck above, they were made to dance under that brightness. So much light, the light of the heavens, and also the light of the heavens reflected on the sea. And then a few black bodies that got somehow free of the dance went jumping into that sea, blind, perhaps confusing the sea they'd never seen before for heaven, God's face in the waters. Waste that, false prophets. The rest of them were sent back to the dark void till the ship reached firmament. She had no words for then, they hadn't given them to her yet. But if she fought back and tried to give words to the memories of the ship and after, there was only the one that had rung out when they'd stood her up before the curious white faces, made her hold out her arms and then hold open her mouth and then hold open her legs. Sold. And was a mama the warm body that made you in a time and a place and a land you couldn't remember? Or was a mama what you made for yourself, the good, warm body, the first kind memory of the older woman who slept beside you in the hayloft, who let you fold into her warmth that first evening that you were owned, and that hummed to you because she couldn't speak what you spoke, and the first sense of love, the earth still for the first time beneath your back, and for the first time through an opening in the roof, the evening sky. You can make do of unspoken kindness in the stars also. There were signs and seasons, and days and years. After a time, she was called Dorothea, named in the mistress's own image. They whooped the name into her, but it couldn't stick right. No, she could say, and then dough for the rhyme. In the end, they tied the two together, called her Doe, and it was good. So that's just a little preview of one of the characters that appears in the book. There are a lot of characters. There's a lot going on. Yeah, and then for those of you who have read it, if you have any questions about the novel, about the research, if anyone has any questions about sort of how one writes a novel, again, this is my debut, I can answer those, and I think you can put them in the chat, and then we'll get those going. Let me see if I can open that up. And hello, everyone. I see everyone coming in from all over and local, which is crazy. So I think I have a question. I'm terrible at this. You'd think I'd be better by now. I think I have a question. So how did you start? Which I'm going to take to me, and how did I start sort of writing? I always knew I wanted to be a writer. As I said, I worked in the library. Before that, I spent a lot of time hanging out in the library. I would read anything that I could get my hands on. And I just knew that I wanted to be a storyteller once I sort of understood that stories were something that came from people's minds and that could sort of connect people in times like this, and bring us together and bring us into other people's minds. I knew that that was what I wanted to do. And then I sort of focused on that through high school. And I went to New York University. In New York, I studied screenwriting because I had delusions of writing for television at that time. But then I decided to focus on a novel because it was sort of something that I could do, you know, by myself without directors or actors or anything like that, sort of something personal. Something that could be, you know, sort of just mine. And so Conjure Women was born in that time. I went to Columbia University to get my MFA, a master's in fine arts. And that was where the novel was sort of born. There was a requirement that we write about 150 pages for a thesis, and I sort of couldn't decide what I wanted to do until the very end. And I came up with this character, this midwife, who lived in this time period and didn't have access to the sort of information that we have, and is sort of forced with providing answers for her society and for her people, and sort of being a voice of reason in a time without reason. And so I really wanted to explore what does that look like for that person, and what is it to be sort of a conjure woman, a healer, a support system, a nurse. in a time when you don't have the answers. And I obviously did not expect the book to come out during a pandemic, but here we are. And I think there are a lot of strange, surprising, frightening connections to that time and the one I was trying to write about. And that's a little bit about how we got here. Let me see if I can just field a few more questions. I'll scroll up. Someone said they really enjoyed the book. Thank you. How did the research influence the writing of the book? Did the inspiration for the book come from the research, or did the research come after the initial idea for the book? That's a really great question. As far as research, so again, I went to New York University and studied screenwriting. I also accidentally, I always say, got a major in history as well, because I took every course that they had in African American history. And that was just out of interest, just out of wanting to sort of access a time period that I didn't know a lot about, and an identity that I didn't know a lot about, being, British African, but also African American, sort of trying to figure out who those people were beyond sort of the books and stories and narratives that we usually have access to. And so just for me, it started out as a feeling of not having enough information, and wanting to sort of, history is stories, right? So sort of live in those stories. So that's sort of where that began, just as an interest. And then when I got to the novel, I was looking for a time period to place my character in, and I thought of the Reconstruction era, which I had studied. And the Reconstruction era, for anyone unsure of it, is, so it's the years just after the Civil War. It's about a 10-year period, when the country was sort of divided, which I'm sure sounds familiar. North and South, the war had been settled, and yet there was winners and losers. There were losses on both sides. And so it was this time when people were trying to define themselves. Yes, Black people were free from slavery, but they didn't have the tools to sort of go forward. They were looking to define themselves. And so for that very strict 10-year period, for that decade, which leads up into the Jim Crow era, which sort of began to limit that freedom in a different way. Black people were sort of figuring out who they were and what it meant to be citizens, or what it meant to be part of America. And they were also rebuilding their own land and their own homes. And so I really wanted to sort of explore, what does freedom look like? And when I began, I had the idea that I would stay in that 10-year period very strictly, again, stay within that decade, 1865 to 1875. But I quickly realized that in order to tell that story, in order to explain the present, as it were, I would have to go into the past, right? And so that's where the braid of the novel really came into play, and sort of weaving in the memories and so the psychological effects of being enslaved. I think that might, so that's a little bit about how I sort of came to write this time period. Definitely, I think the research inspired a lot of the short sort of stories that appear throughout the book. There's sort of these episodes similar to the one I read about the Mid-Atlantic Passage. There's these also episodes of sort of revival churches, sort of beliefs and practices of midwifery at the time. And I did a lot of research into healing practices, into beliefs, into sort of folk stories of the era, which we can get into a little bit later, because that's sort of my pet favorite of the novel, is sort of how the folk stories and folk history influence healing. But yeah, I just sort of took the research, and I wanted to dive in and create these different sort of little stories that would connect into a history. Any novel ideas in the works? I am currently working on my next novel. I'm working on the first draft right now, and my editor is waiting for it as we speak. And that is, it has a lot of similarities to Conjure Women, in that it is historical fiction. If you've read the novel, you know there are a lot of twists and turns and surprises, which I love. So my new novel is a bit of a mystery. It's a thriller set during the Harlem Renaissance. So it's sort of this jazz era wish fulfillment world where a murder is at the center of everything. And so it explores the time period and also has lots of plot twists to keep readers excited. So that's what I'm working on. Hopefully, getting all the theories and the murderers in the right places. So looking forward to sharing that in the coming years, hopefully. Let's see, more questions. Keep them coming, guys. Are the characters based on actual historical figures or individuals you ran across in your research? So none of the characters are based directly on any one historical figure, but I certainly tried to draw from various figures that I found in my research and sort of create a composite midwife or a composite preacher that would sort of fit my narrative. And a lot of my research came from the Works Project Administration in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Created an initiative for artists to sort of go down south and interview former enslaved people. So these people were in their 80s and 90s, and they were telling this government, much like the census, telling the government, their experiences in slavery and what they remember from usually their childhoods at that point of being enslaved people in the South. And so it's this really rich history that I believe is in the public sphere. So if you wanted to access it, just Google it. But it's really rich, it's really long. There's so many first person accounts. And I found that was a really great place for me to start, to get that voice and to get that, those sort of rich memories and experiences. My favorite ones were done by Zora Neale Hurston, who is an author most well known for Their Eyes Were Watching God. But she's an anthropologist, she's a folklorist, and she participated in this research. And her interviews, I felt, were sort of the most honest. Again, if anyone's filled out the census or spoken to any government officials, there's always a little bit of guard that I think people have. And so that's part of the public record, as well as sort of figuring out how honest are people going to be in these surveys and with these stories of saying what it was like to be enslaved when the government was the one that was putting those restrictions in place. So it's a difficult record to deal with, but it also is sort of rich because these people are talking about their childhoods. They're talking about their mothers and their fathers and the traditions in their community, and even the things that made them happy about the sort of rigid life and the things their parents would cook, or the music that they listened to. And so I tried to put all of that into the story in different parts. So I drew very, very heavily from sort of those first person accounts, but I didn't pick any one real historical figure to put everything on. Let's see, I love these questions. Keep them coming, guys. I'm gonna scroll. Hi, I love this book, thank you. Since then, no book compares. I love it, I love it. Those of you who haven't read it, please do. What was your writing process? Did you write each part of the braid separately? How do you keep track, or did it flow for you? That's a really great question, thank you. My writing process is chaotic. Those who know me personally know that I tend to write at night. Usually from about 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. I am writing. Conjure Women was this really strange experience in that I definitely didn't know what I wanted it to be. And so it was an exercise in sort of writing these different stories and exploring different scenes and different sort of, again, the histories definitely inspired things I wanted to sort of break apart and open up. And then there were, again, the sort of the idea of a preacher, the idea of a conjure woman, or someone who is viewed as magic in the community. I definitely wanted to sort of explore each of those little ideas before coming out with a larger plot. So the plot overall definitely came in secondary, and the braid also kind of again worked out of necessity, right? So it was sort of, I would write a scene, maybe of Rue helping birth a baby, and then I wanted to explore, well, how did she learn that? You know, when she was young, what was the first child that she saw that maybe was experiencing trauma or was sick or that she wasn't able to save? And so then I would go back and sort of write that scene and figure out where in the story I wanted to place it. And so it was a lot of experimentation. I wrote it very quickly, the first draft, in about 9 months, which I always say is perfect for a book about babies. But after that, I worked with my amazing editor at Random House, Kate Medina is her name. And we sort of looked at these stories and we looked at where do they go, right? What order will they appear in? Excuse me. What order will they appear in, and how does that change sort of the narrative? How does that change how the story is received? And so we spent a lot of time moving things around. We spent a lot of time reimagining some characters, bringing characters back from the beginning and putting them in the end. And so that process took about 2 to 3 years, sort of putting it all together and seeing what it could be. But yes, very chaotic, but it did flow. It did flow. I think there was a certain level of the characters speaking through me and discovering what they were all about by writing it. Really enjoyed this book. Thank you. Signed copies. I would love to get some signed copies, especially out to the Woodbridge Library. As everyone knows, things are wild, but that is definitely on my to-do. There are also some bookstores that I think will be having signed copies available. So I will, if anyone follows me on social media, Instagram, Twitter, I will absolutely post if anyone wanted to be able to purchase some. But I'm hoping to get some to the public library here very soon. Yay, lots of questions. Please tell us about the symbolism of the Haints, the foxes, the vixen. What sickness would be similar contemporary to the one the kids and the adults were suffering? So beginning with the sickness, and sort of all the illnesses in the book, for anyone who's read it, they all are very vague. I didn't want to attribute them to any one particular illness, specifically Bean, who is the main character, or one of the main characters, one of the main children that we meet in the story. He has sort of an illness based on appearance, but I didn't want to name it or attach it to any one specific illness. So they're all sort of magic, all sort of imaginary, all sort of magical. As for the specific mysterious illness that is in the story, I will say that a hint is that it has something to do with the water. There's a lot of baptisms that are taking place in the town, and the water is an important thread. So if you ever reread, you might want to follow that. It might tell you a little bit more about how that functions in the story. And as for symbolism of the Haints, so the Haints are ghosts, and ghosts are, for me, and as they function in this novel, they sort of are echoes of, again, that past that we can't sort of escape, right? The long-lasting effects of slavery. So for these people, they're only, 3 or 4 years removed from their experiences as slaves, and so they're absolutely haunted by those experiences, but also the memories of their personal relationships. So Rue and Verena, again, Verena's the landowner, the plantation owner's daughter, and Verena and Rue sort of grow up together. They have this very close relationship when they're young, and as they sort of grow up and define their places in the world, and as their places in the world are defined for them, they sort of begin to understand that their friendship is going to be fraught, and that is the experience of that is sort of a ghost that is haunting Rue, the choices that she made with her friend haunt her. And so the ghosts in the novel sort of hold these multiple metaphors of the past and the things we can't let go, and the importance of sort of looking at those traumas, whether it be in American history, whether it be in your personal life, and sort of facing them if you ever hope to not be haunted by them. And as for the foxes, specifically the vixen, so the foxes appear throughout the book as Miss Maybell's familiars, if you will. So she's sort of the more witchy descendant or antecedent of Rue. She's Rue's mother, and she has more of sort of a physical connection to the nature and the plantation itself. And so she has these foxes that kind of run around and witness things for her. But the inspiration for the foxes came from folklore. There's a lot of foxes and there's a lot of rabbits in the novel. So the rabbits are from Brer Rabbit, which is sort of a descendant of the trickster and Nancy, which is from West Africa, which is where my family came from. And those are the stories that I heard growing up, where the Nancy sort of trickster stories and the trickster tales, and he sort of outwits the bigger, stronger animals. Usually, in the African stories, they're usually lions and things like that. But in the American version, they are Brer Fox. So a Nazi sort of traveled through the Middle Passage and through slavery and through people's memories, and sort of became this American version, which is Brer Rabbit. And his main enemy is Brer Fox. And so I sort of play with those ideas within the novel, with that structure of sort of trickster magic. But I also wanted to just explore the way that those stories are passed down, and the reasons why folklore and trickster tales are so important to a culture that is otherwise being lost or being buried or being ignored. And why it's sort of important to tell those stories to your children, to teach them how to survive in a world that might make them the smallest animal. Let's see. Where can I get this book? I would love to read it. Thank you, Jenny. Hopefully you won't be able to put it down. It's 400 pages. It's a big old book, but hopefully it's something you can dive into. You can get it at your local library. Brilliant. I always recommend libraries. If you can't get it at the library, I recommend a local bookstore, because they absolutely need our help right now, as all small businesses do. But yeah, anywhere books are sold, they have my little old book. So do check that out. Let's see, I don't want to skip anybody. Keep adding them. I don't know how long we're allowed to keep going, but I'll try to get to as many as I can. We did start late. Sorry, guys. Big technical difficulties. Let's see. Can you talk a little bit about the power dynamics between Rue and Verena? Sure. So once again, Rue is the young Black midwife, who's our main character, who sort of grows up during slavery, on the plantation, and then through the Civil War, and she sort of becomes into adulthood after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era. And Verena is the plantation master's daughter. And sort of when they're young, as was true, as was factual in my research, was that these children would have very close relationships. In the sort of Victorian era, children were seen and not heard. And so white children and Black children played together. The master's children would spend time together. And I wanted to explore sort of what it means to grow up with a friend and realize that maybe the dynamics that you think you've established can't last, that the world has different definitions of who you can and can't be, and what that sort of does to your relationship. And so for Rue and Verena, there is this sort of push and pull of who has power. And it sort of echoes the changing landscape, right? So the Civil War devastates the South, right or wrong. There's sort of this war of attrition, and so the South is destroyed, the plantation is destroyed, and the life that Verena, as a Southern belle, sort of expected to have is completely destroyed. And so their power dynamics sort of shift. And if anyone has a copy of the book, you might have noticed that Rue and Verena make up the cover, and I like to say you can always like turn it around and see who's on top, and that's sort of how the story plays out. But yeah, it's just an exploration of sort of racial dynamics, of gender roles as well, because they're both women. But Verena, as a white woman, has very different sort of expectations and limitations that Rue does and does not have. And so I wanted to really explore the interpersonal dynamics and also the history of this like very quickly changing time period. Can you put the name of that in the chat, please? Put the name of, I'm not sure what, put the name of the book. The book is Zora Neale Hurston. Yeah, Zora Neale Hurston is, again, from the Harlem Renaissance, actually. She was a very prominent writer and one of my favorite authors. And she did interviews for the Works Progress Administration. It kind of goes by two different names, but the WPA in the 1930s during the New Deal conducted interviews. And so if you search any of that, if you search Zora Neale Hurston, that will come up. Barracoon is one of her most, obviously she's passed on, but Barracoon is one of her most recently rediscovered books, which I loved. And that tells the story of, it's a true story, it's one of her interviews of the last slave that was brought over from Africa, so the last known slave ship and the oldest living descendant at the time from that, which also figures into the excerpts that I read for you guys. So the idea of the memory of the Middle Passage, and so that's one of my favorites. I read that absolutely while I was writing, so that's something to look into as well. And then Their Eyes Were Watching, Their Eyes Were Watching God is her most well-known novel, so definitely check her out. Can you please, with a cherry on top, answer Marielle's question? We read your book in book club. I don't know if I got to it. I will look for it. I did. The Haynes. Yes. Yeah, so the foxes and the rabbits all came from that sort of folklore. And I do think this is a very fun book for book clubs, because I personally love books that you can sort of argue about the meaning. And so I think you guys might have a more, an even richer and more in-depth interpretation of some of that. And I that was definitely my intent, to sort of use these images in various different ways to sort of spark readers' imaginations. And you loved it, thank you. But yes, book clubs, do that, they're fun. Who narrated the audiobook? The audiobook was narrated by Adenarelli Ojo, is her name, and she is magnificent. I would absolutely recommend the audiobook. I did get to participate in choosing her as a reader, which is, authors don't get to choose a lot of things, so that was huge for me. And she does an amazing job. I think it brings so much life into the book. So if you can get the audiobook, which I think you guys have, right?
Yes, I definitely second the audiobook. I read it via audiobook and it was amazing. Definitely second that. And it is available on Overdrive via audiobook.
Yeah, so absolutely get that. That is, I mean, she brought a world to the novel that way that I couldn't have even imagined. So absolutely listen to that. Did you know from the beginning that Bra Abel would turn out to have so many demons, so to speak? Did you know he would be a scoundrel? Yes. I knew Bra Abel would be a scoundrel because I think scoundrels are fun. As far as his demons, I think that was something that I discovered in writing him. Again, I like to sort of write outwards and figure out my characters while I'm doing it. And so I didn't have his backstory completely figured out when I started writing, but I knew that for him to be a scoundrel, he had to have a rich backstory. And I had a strong sense that in the novel, I didn't want there to be any villains. I wanted to sort of be able to, again, explore the past for all these characters and figure out what sort of brought them to the places where they find themselves, what brings them to the decisions, good or bad, that they make. And so it's a lot about history. And so I knew that Bra Abel was going to have a complex history early on. I would love to sign it. I'd love to find you guys. Again, I'm hoping I can send some out, and I will definitely post about signed books very soon. Yes, so the cover. The cover is another thing that I was very fortunate enough to have some input on, and and I'm looking around because I actually have a very early edition of the book, which, if you've noticed, has the dresses different. So actually, Verena's dress should be green, or Verena's dress should be red, and Rue's dress should be green, and we changed that in the next edition, but the one I'm reading from is wrong. But yes, so the cover, which is gorgeous, depicts the topsy-turvy dolls, which feature into the story quite a bit. As someone mentioned, Rue's mother makes a doll which sort of functions as a voodoo doll in the novel. But historically, the topsy-turvy dolls, so the dolls with sort of two heads, are a real thing from this time period. They're a real toy that children played with, a real doll. And what sort of sparked that for me was the fact that historians aren't really sure how these dolls functioned. So there's sort of a belief that maybe Black children would play with them and they weren't allowed to have white dolls, so they weren't allowed to have Black dolls that looked like them. So they would play with the white doll, and then when the master left, they would flip them over and play with the doll that looked like their babies. The other sort of explanation is that the Black children might want to sort of play the roles that their mothers were playing. So they had their own Black child, and then they'd also have the white child that they were the nurse for. And so it's sort of this idea of children sort of emulating their mothers, which is, if you've read the book, is a huge part of Rue's sort of self-discovery of the woman that she wants to be, and of sort of learning her role in society. And so it figures largely into the book and appears on the cover. So many questions, keep them coming. They're popping up on my screen. Perfect. Yes, the interviews from slaves, WPA. Book clubs, always do book clubs, especially in these fraught times. They're so big, so important. Loved it, thank you. Language and imagery, again, Zori Neale Hurston. And those interviews were a huge part of sort of getting the language and getting the voice. And I really wanted to do justice to sort of the Southern voice, because I think it's sort of been maligned in that it's not respected as sort of as a literary voice. And so I really wanted to emulate the folklore and the way those stories would be told, and keep a very like rich Southern Gothic tone. So that was very important to me. The characters are endearing. Thank you. Oh, audiobook is great. Signed copy. I will say also that I recommend reading it twice, which is easy for me to say. You can still find Topsy-Turvy dolls, especially in museum shops. Yes, I have seen the Red Riding Hood and Big Bad Wolf. I actually think that might have been one of the things I sent to the artist that made the cover. There are historical ones. I think they even have Frozen Topsy-Turvy dolls that they make with Elsa and the other one from the movie Frozen. So they're still in production. I think that's sort of the fascinating thing for me was the endurance of the things that children play with and the ways they learn. Again, the way they sort of emulate the people they're going to be when they grow up. Yes, Saint Martin. Yeah, I really wanted to sort of look at the transition again of from Africa to the islands to the South in America and sort of see what held up, what stories, what traditions, particularly in healing practices and particularly in folklore, held up across the journey. Another one, I think we're getting to the end of the questions. If anyone wants to add a few more, who are some of the authors you admire and what are you reading? Zora Neale Hurston, I'll plug her one more time because she's amazing. Toni Morrison, absolutely. One of the things I read or was reading when I began the novel was Octavia Butler. She has Kindred. She has Parable of the Sower, which is very, it's sort of an apocalypse novel, so it's very haunting. But yes, Kindred was sort of a big inspiration for me, and that it is, I think they made a movie actually very recently inspired by it, but it's sort of a woman in the 1970s, a Black woman who is accidentally transported back in time to the plantation era, and she's obviously confused for an enslaved woman, and so just the idea of magic as it relates to history, as it relates to sort of these difficult time periods and sort of imbuing them with magic and a little bit of excitement, a little bit of plot twists, I think was really important to me. And so those Toni Morrison Beloved, those sorts of novels that sort of play with magical realism and also these sort of complicated histories are my favorite. Sarah Waters is another favorite. Just out of left field, I love historical fiction. Philippa Gregory is another one that I love, contemporary. Right now I'm reading, and I'm looking at it because it's right in front of me, but I took the cover off. Gods of Jade and Shadow, Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Again, another magical realism, another historical fiction, which I love. And then, so that's what I'm reading right now. We talked a lot about the wings in book club. I don't have a, well, thank you all for all the great questions. In the wings, I think you mean, I think you're referring to the bird at the beginning of the novel and who reappears at the end. So a runaway sort of is given wings by Miss Maybelle, and that's one of the very first stories we encounter in the novel, so that she can flee to the north to escape slavery. And sort of that, the wings, as it were, is sort of a recurring thing in folklore and in slave history, and the idea that sort of either when you die or when you're sort of freed from the bonds of slavery, you gain wings. So I really wanted to explore those kinds of images. So the book is very much inspired by folklore and sort of recurring images, and just sort of bringing them into the modern era, I think, a little bit. I didn't expect it, again, to be as modern, as reflective of our times as it turned out to be, but I think it's hopefully enduring, and it gives you the opportunity to sort of look at, again, race relations, gender, sickness and healing in sort of different ways. Yeah, there's a lot going on in the novel, but it was such a pleasure to write. I'm so glad that so many of you enjoyed it. I think there's still some popping up. Feel free to send them as long as Woodbridge Public Library isn't going to kick me off. I'll keep answering them. Did Jonah leave Sarah simply for the job up north, or was there more to it? Was he just miserable that's why he's not having their third child? So some spoilers for anyone that hasn't read it, but there are characters, Sarah and Jonah. So Jonah is a character who Rue sort of has a crush on him, but he's a theoretically a married family man, but we'll discover there's sort of complications with that. I really was interested in sort of the history of the migration. So the Great Migration is another thing that sort of ends the Reconstruction era, and it's sort of a lot of these sort of freed slaves began to move up north to escape persecution, lynching. A lot of Jim Crow era sort of atrocities were happening in the South at that time. So there's a great migration north, and so Jonah's sort of flight from the plantation for a job opportunity, it sort of mirrors that movement. And then Jonah is sort of attacked, and I don't want to get into it too deeply because, again, that is a bit of a spoiler. But again, these characters sort of stand in for all these different aspects of history, and for Jonah, he definitely represents sort of a male figure in a community where Black males are threatening, are dangerous, and especially during the Civil War when a lot of the male white plantation owners were leaving to join up. They had to have people in charge of their plantations. And so Jonah fulfills that requirement, but there are sort of concessions that have to be made for him to be able to do that. And so he has a complicated identity that's related to that, to be coy. We're wondering what happens to Rue from her 20s to her 80s at the end. What do you imagine her life was like? Sequel. Did I miss one? It's the top of the list. Thank you all. I hope you read it and I hope you enjoy it. So in the very last chapter of the book actually was something I wrote very early on, knowing that I wanted to sort of transcend different times. And so the last chapter of the book is 1929. Again, not to give too much away, but it is in the future when Rue was 80. And I wanted to, and this, I feel like this chapter is something I talked to my editor, my agent a lot about, whether we wanted to include this sort of extreme flash forward. But I definitely wanted to make clear that this time period doesn't exist in isolation, right? So the effects of slavery, the effects of the Jim Crow era are long lasting, are reach into our time period. And so I wanted to have sort of the last moments of Rue's adult life portrayed in a short section at the end of the novel, just to remind us that time moved on, and also to sort of explore. So at the end, she's in a hospital, a sort of modern style hospital. And I wanted to sort of explore the way that folk healing and midwifery sort of changed in that time period to hospitals and to male doctors and to white doctors, and sort of explore that time change as well. And so that was the impetus to put that in the book. As for what Rue is doing, I think, I think it's a very sad novel. There's a lot of dark elements, a lot of tragic histories, a lot of shameful things. But I think Rue, by the end of the main section of the novel, kind of comes into her own. she kind of defines herself as a healer, as a midwife, as the kind of woman that she wants to be. So I think she carries on with a lot of the same sorts of adventures of healing. I think she kind of becomes that witch in the woods a little bit, that she always kind of was. And that sort of image that we've seen a lot of times with the healing woman that lives alone. How did she end up there? I think Rue sort of begins to tell us that story, and I think that's what she spends her life doing, is taking care of people. And I think she finds a way to be proud of it. As for a sequel, probably not. We never know, I guess. But I think I again enjoy letting the reader sort of fill in those gaps and fill in what they think might have happened. Hello, I think maybe we have time for the last couple questions.
I think we just got one more.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you so much for all the sweetness. Okay, so the last one was Rue hiding Verena in the church, more so to protect her or more so a type of revenge? 50-50, 50-70.
Spoilers.
Spoilers. 50-70. I think again, it is a complicated history. There are no villains in this novel, but there's a lot of anger and hurt and lost promise. And I think Rue has to reconcile a lot of things with Verena. And also, I think if it's 50-70, it might be like 40-60-20. The 20 being that it's hard, even if your past is painful, even if you were enslaved or anything of that sort. I think there is a fear of the world changing too quickly, and so I think keeping Verena with her lets her have part of her childhood and lets her have part of even her mother, and things that are sort of familiar that she couldn't have otherwise. And I think she is attached to those things, especially staying in the plantation. Yeah.
I guess
That's
one more from
yeah.
Sophia. She has a good one.
Okay. So glad you're enjoying it. Hope you didn't get too many spoilers. You're welcome. Is there a character that you identify with or feel especially connected to? Quick thing, because I usually get to mention it in interviews, but I wrote the story of Rue again, sort of very quickly, over a 9-month span. Didn't know what her story was, but a lot of time is spent with her mother and sort of figuring out what it means to be a healer and take care of people. My own mother was a nurse. She was a home health aide. A lot of the time she would take me with her to these people's homes while she was taking care of them, which is something I didn't even realize I was writing into the book. And Miss Maybelle is nothing like my mother at all. Disclaimer, but I think that part of sort of trying to figure out what kind of adult you want to be, what it means to be in the world, all of that, for me is very close to sort of my heart and the way I grew up. And so I think that aspect of Rue is very much the closest to me. But I think there's a little bit of me in all the characters. If Brable's a scoundrel, I think I have a bit of scoundrel in me, and I like Verena's spunk, and I think Miss Mabel's sort of magic is aspirational as well. So I think all the characters have a little bit of me in them as well.
Well, I hate to end this conversation because I read this book and I loved it. I'm a big historical fiction fan
You
myself.
are.
I
know.
think, yes, because me and Afia used to be co-workers together at the Island Library. I used to mostly bother her while she would be diligently doing her work.
Nonsense.
But this book was like beautifully written, beautifully researched, and like you said, it oddly had some strong ties to now, which, kind of odd, but hey, here we go. In the psychological effects of slavery and how that still is apparent in our society. And I thought you did that beautifully, braided everything together. And, you know, on behalf of the Woodbridge Public Library, we thank you so much for doing this, and we thank you so much for coming out and giving your time to us. Everyone here is so proud of you and so happy for you. So I just want you to know that. Island Library especially, everyone there, super excited for you. And, you know, I know a lot of people mentioned signed books, at least for Woodbridge Township. You know, hopefully in the future, we'll be able to arrange something where
we're gonna make it happen.
Person. That was what we originally had planned, but of course, the world had other plans. But, you know, hopefully if, you know, you guys keep track of our calendars, and when the world opens up again, hopefully we'll be able to do something. Who knows, it might be for the next book, to be honest.
Yeah, hope so.
It might be a double feature. But,
that would be brilliant.
Oh, I would love that. But thank you again to everybody who came tonight and came out to listen to Afia speak. This presentation is going to be available on our YouTube channel. So if you would like to, you know, go back to something she said, or, you know, look up the Zora Neale Hurston information a little bit more, you know, you can rewind back to that section. And we thank you guys for coming out and participating in tonight's event.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting.
Of course, of course. Like I said, thank you all, everybody.